Alex, thanks for joining us again.
Thanks for having me. It's good to see you all.
Yeah, the last time we spoke, we were in Australia, right?
In 2018.
And I was in a toga, right?
That's going to take some explaining.
Now we'll just put the photo up unexplained.
Okay, go ahead.
Yeah. So, I mean, you have this new book out, and one of the things that I thought was most interesting about it is you hear a lot about the United Front Work Department. You hear a lot about that if you're somebody who's really interested in China. I don't think anyone on TikTok knows about it. But you think of the United Front Work Department as the one doing these sort of international influence operations. The United Front is actually a branch of the Communist Party itself. But in your book, you say that it's actually a lot of this work is being done by the Ministry of State Security, kind of China's spy agency, to simplify it, which I thought had the reputation of being kind of not so competent.
Yeah, that's right. I think people think of the Ministry of State Security, the MSS, as a kind of thuggish counterintelligence agency that's going around roughing up dissidents and Falun Gong practitioners. But the reality is that it has really professional parts of it, but it's an organization with easily well over 100,000 employees. You've got people working in backwater provinces, but then I really focus in this book on a particular bureau of the MSS's headquarters, the 12th Bureau, or the Social Investigation Bureau, that plugs into United Front work, that takes the lead on elite influence operations, and I think is really a hidden force behind a lot of China's influence and power overseas.
So when you say like this bureau of the MSS is like sort of taking the lead with the United Front Work Department, like what does that mean? Like, where do these two organizations rank in comparison to each other? Or why you need two groups doing the same thing? Like, what's going on?
Yeah, I think there are still a lot of things that we don't understand about how this works, and I hope people write many more books trying to unravel what's going on here. But kind of the way that I look at it basically is that the United Front Work Department has some involvement in covert and clandestine operations, but it itself is not a spy agency. It doesn't have law enforcement powers. It doesn't seem to have the same kind of training and culture that intelligence agencies have. It doesn't seem to have very much foreign language expertise, but that's all stuff that the MSS specializes in. So the way I see the relationship between the two is that the United Front Work Department is busy building up networks all around the world, within China, in ethnic Chinese communities, in religious communities, in ethnic minority communities, and so on. And then you get the United Front Work Department kind of sitting atop of that, plugging itself into these existing CCP-aligned networks and using that as a recruiting ground and as an operating ground for more sophisticated covert and clandestine activities.
You mean the MSS is sitting on top, or the United Front?
The MSS.
Oh, I spoke. Well, I mean, I know it's more than just influencing overseas Chinese communities. Like, I think a lot of people, if they've heard of the MSS, might have heard about it from the recent Twitter whistleblower who said Twitter basically hired an agent of the MSS and didn't really seem to care.
I think this, just really speaks to the extent of MSS operations. They're not just working within Chinese communities. As the book shows, they're really working hard against elites. They're seeking to understand and influence political systems overseas, using China's heft as an economic power to build connections. And this case with Twitter is just one example of that.
Well, if there are any MSS agents secretly working in YouTube, hello.
Yeah, well, speaking of the MSS influencing elites.
Well, actually, before we get into that, I was just going to ask, what do you think most people get wrong about the MSS?
I think, it's people tend to think that spying is just something that matters to governments and it doesn't really have strategic consequences. It's seen as this thing that governments have to engage in, but it's a kind of war of attrition where you have, the CIA spying on the KGB spying back on the CIA, and they're kind of balancing each other in a way. But what I really try to show is that it's so much more than that it's not just about stealing government secrets or stealing advanced technology. what the MSS seems to have really emphasized is elite influence operations. And this is something that has I think changed and affected the way that people understand China and affected international policy on China. So it's something that has strategic consequences.
So one of the things I like about your book is that you give very specific examples of this MSS elite capture. And one of the people that the MSS seems to have built a relationship with is George Soros. Can you talk a bit about that?
Yeah, it was a really interesting case, and it was really the starting point for my book as well, because Soros himself talked about his run-in with the MSS quite publicly in several different contexts, in his memoir, in a speech at Davos. So he'd been burnt by the MSS and had sort of, lived to tell the tale, essentially. And what happened was that in the 80s, this period, I think, of genuine liberalization and reform inside China, Soros saw this as an opportunity to push his political philanthropy inside China, promote liberal values. So he set up a foundation there. He got a lot of high-level government backing. But I think what he didn't realize is that reformists were really on the out at the time. And very quickly, the MSS basically knocked on the door of his foundation and said, we're going to take over this operation. So they actually used a front group for the MSS to become the partner organization of Soros's foundation in China in 1988, and then were appropriating funds for their own purposes, funding their own international exchanges, bringing visitors over. All the actual liberal intellectuals who'd been funded by the group were scared off. And then in the lead up to the Tiananmen massacre, Soros pulled the plug on the whole operation because working with the MSS is not a way to promote liberal values within China. This was more of a kind of defensive operation, I think, at the time, but it really shows the kind of boldness of the MSS. You had an undercover vice minister of the Ministry of State Security, one of the second in commands of the agency, go directly to Soros and talk to him and convince him to cede control of his organization to the MSS.
Did Soros know it was the MSS?
At the time, he was actually aware of it, but his explanation is that he thought that his foundation was under pressure from the Ministry of Public Security, so another domestically focused intelligence agency in China. And he thought that with all the factional wrangling within the Chinese Communist Party, partnering with the MSS was his only way to keep this foundation going, that they could kind of hold off the MPS through partnering with his foundation. But clearly it's a double-edged sword.
Right. It's like choosing to side with the CIA instead of the FBI if both organizations were mainly focused on persecuting people.
Yeah, that's right. I don't think there's really any safe way to cooperate as an individual and not a government with Chinese intelligence agencies.
Well, I mean, I know George Soros has recently been very critical of Xi Jinping, writing a couple op-eds, I forget in which
And that
papers.
speech at Davos, too.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I wouldn't be surprised if that early experience in China really kind of burned him on.
I wish more people had learned from his experiences and been like, you know what, maybe this is an authoritarian regime that we shouldn't get close with.
Yeah, and I think one of the remarkable things with Soros is that after the Tiananmen massacre, he actually saw that as spelling the end of the Chinese Communist Party. He thought that even though these protests had been crushed, the party was doomed, that liberalism was rising within China. And I think this really defines the way a lot of the West viewed these activities and kind of explains why people were able to look past all of that, look past Soros's bad experiences in the 80s and keep engaging with China with that hope of a more open country.
Yeah, it's one thing that's interesting that you talk about in your book, how the MSS was able to kind of co-opt that wish or belief from a lot of these elites in liberal democracies that China was going to become more liberal. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, I think it's a bit of a misconception about influence operations that they're just there to change people's minds or shift perceptions, change policy making. Whereas I see the main effect of these MSS and just CCP influence operations generally as being holding people back, keeping them, enthralled by these naive beliefs about where China was going. So in the case of the MSS, you could see them kind of looking at the way that foreigners understood China, looking at their hopes and dreams for China, that China would become a liberal democratic country, that it would become westernized, that it would slot itself into the existing international order, and just playing this back. So reflecting this, amplifying it, rather than seeking to, find those people who are really concerned about the Chinese Communist Party and change their mind. It's just about empowering those who are already saying the things that the Chinese Communist Party wants them to say, giving them access to China, giving them more status, reinforcing those views.
So really, they're all about empowerment.
That's right. It's a progressive agenda.
It's kind of about also reinforcing like people believing that they're right? Like if these people already had these views and then they're being told, oh, yes, this is what we're going to do, then they feel more assured that,
Shell, you're absolutely right. I totally agree.
Yeah. I'm an expert on China. Like I know what they're going to do. They're going to liberalize.
That's true. And also really taking advantage of the hope.
Mm.
Yeah. It makes it so hard to push back against because you can't point to someone specifically having their mind changed by the MSS. But these people have nonetheless been influenced by them. They've been encouraged by the MSS. They feel like they've been given privileged access and insights into the direction of the Chinese Communist Party, which in some cases might contradict what the party says publicly. But, when you've had a meeting with Li Keqiang, with Jiang Zemin, and he's told you China's about to become a democracy or is moving towards liberalism, to a lot of people that counts for so much more than what they read in the press.
Yeah, of course they're going to have to say the party propaganda out loud, but behind closed doors, that's the real thing.
You heard it personally,
from
right?
Jiang Zemin, great guy.